Our second speaker for this afternoon then, who's actually, I guess, all the way from Brazil. Where are you? He's here. Excellent. Matheus Ferreira.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Matheus. I'm from Brazil. I'm a journalist and also a master's student at São Paulo State University. I came to Australia to study media and accessibility along with Professor Kate Ellis at Curtin University. So I'll present here, it's a small piece of my work that we've been doing, mostly about the policies on digital accessibility, especially on news media companies. So I have three goals here today. First, to describe the Brazilian legal framework on digital accessibility, showing the evolution of the legislation. Second, is to explain the whole civil inquiry that is brand new in Brazil, that is a civil inquiry that investigated how media companies were dealing with digital accessibility. And I delve into their answers to see the posture of the companies towards disability. And in the end, I want to show the consequences of this civil inquiry. I brought here a timeline. There's for those who cannot see, there's a timeline here with some years and the points I'm going to talk about. I start with 2014. That was the year when the complaint was brought in by an institution of people with disabilities. I'll explain later. Then this complaint was accepted by the Public Prosecutor's Office. I'll call just PPO because it's easier. If you can understand, Public Prosecutor's Office, I'll call PPO. So the PPO accepted these complaints and started an investigation. So they sent questions to the media companies saying, why do you don't have accessibility on your websites? The companies answer. In 2016, we have a big change in the Brazilian legal system. The Brazilian Inclusion Act was approved. It was the first Brazilian legislation that mandates digital accessibility in private websites in Brazil. So after that, the PPO decided to question again the media companies. And we can see, we will be able to see that the companies changed their arguments on why they don't have accessible websites. And in the end, I'll talk about the public civil claim. Oh, thank you. That is the legal consequence of the civil inquiry. So the complaint. The complaint was brought in by the National Federation for Education and Integration of the Deaf. I'll call FENEIS, the Brazilian acronym. So this organization filed a complaint in 2014 to the Public Prosecutor's Office, the PPO. It's a Brazilian branch that oversees compliance to legislation. Although it does not have enforcement powers, it can investigate and hear the positions and file suits on both federal or state laws or state courts. The content of the complaint was about that for this institution that represents deaf and hearing-impaired people, there was no accessibility in the news websites, especially on videos. There are no subtitles and closed captions because this institution was of the impaired hearing people, so accessibility for them was about closed captions and subtitles. The complaint was against 11 companies in Brazil, among newspapers and TV broadcasters and general portals. And the main argument was that not providing subtitles and closed captions, it hampered the access of deaf and hearing-impaired people to online information. After this complaint, the PPO accepted the complaint and launched the investigation. So it sent to 11 companies this question: why do your videos don't show accessibility, subtitles, and closed captions? The PPO sent these questions to the CEOs of these 11 companies, but who answered, of course, was the law firms, the lawyers answer. But in my opinion, we can see the posture of the companies through these answers of the lawyers. The main point of the questioning was that not providing accessibility features on online websites was unlawful to the law 10098 and unlawful to the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. This law, the law 10098 in Brazil, it establishes the basic criteria and the general rules to promote accessibility. For instance, there's an article, the Article 17, that states that the government has the responsibility to eliminate information and communication barriers. So it states that the government is responsible to promote accessibility, not so much impose some responsibility to the companies. Also, this law establishes some accessibility requirements, but only for broadcast services as accessibility and subtitles. Nothing too explicit on digital accessibility. So the other law that the PPOs say that's very important is the UN Convention, because in Brazil, the UN Convention is now part of our constitution, so it's very important. There's a very interesting article on the convention that states that the states that signed the law have to urge private entities to provide information and services in accessible formats that can be used by people with disabilities. So in the view of the PPO, all these two laws underpin the right to access information in Brazil. So here I have the first answers, the first responses by the companies. First, we have here a big newspaper in Brazil, Folha de São Paulo, I think the biggest one, answered that producing videos with accessibility was costly and laborious, and that the law would only apply to broadcast services. Another company, O Globo, that has both a newspaper and a broadcast company, said that there was no legal provision to produce accessible content to people with disabilities on the internet. So in a large picture, all the companies are saying there is no law that mandates me to produce content for you with disabilities. Then in 2016, we have a big change. There was approved the Brazilian Inclusion Act. There was a long process of discussion of this law since 2006 to be approved only in 2016, so almost 10 years discussing this legislation. The article I want to talk about that specifically talks about web accessibility is the Article 6.3. It states, I will read because for me it's the most important part of all legislation of this law. So it states like this. Accessibility is mandatory on websites maintained by companies with headquarters or commercial representations in the countries. That means the news companies that have headquarters in Brazil have to provide accessible websites. There's one tricky thing, that have to provide accessibility according to the best practices and accessibility guidelines adopted internationally. I'll talk about why I think it's a bit tricky. So after this approval of this legislation, the PPO decided to send a second round of questioning to these companies. One thing that is interesting here is because the whole process began with accessibility being treated as related to only subtitles and closed captions. After this legislation, the PPO now treats accessibility as one thing that reaches everybody, is related to every person with a disability. So in this questioning, the second questioning, the PPO sent a term of adjustment of conduct. So it basically asks that the company sign a contract saying that they will transform their websites in accessibility, transforming accessible websites. And if they didn't this, they would receive a fine of 10,000 reais. And altogether with this term of adjustment of conduct, they sent a copy of the W3C's handbook. It's a very simple book that talks about how important is accessibility for business, nothing too much technical. So here we have the second round of answers that we can see a change that this legislation caused on the posture of the companies. First one, we have here another company, Terra. So this is a very big portal in Brazil. This company stated, the Brazilian Inclusion Act was not self-applicable, since there were no objective criteria to define what best practices are. So as I talked before, in the legislation we have all websites have to be accessible according to the best practices. But the law does not say what best practices are. So this is now the new argument of the companies. Another company, Global Network. The legislation does not demand accessibility resources on the internet and also does not explain what best accessibility features are. And even this company asked for deadlines, because in Brazil, regarding accessibility features on broadcast companies, there were a deadline produced by the government. So they are saying, oh, you want me to be accessible on the internet, but you don't say how many times I have to do this, what I have to do. So another company, the other big newspaper in Brazil, Estado de São Paulo, said that these best practices, this cause a certain uncertainty regarding the article. So, and we can agree that it's a bit tricky. So it's not clear what best practices are. So that prevents the company from engaging in a commitment to digital accessibility. This is the most common argument I found in these documents. This is almost 400 pages of this whole civil inquiry I have to research. And just two answers was a little different. And I think that's a bit problematic for the companies. Because, for instance, one company said its website was already accessible. So I don't need to do anything. My website is already accessible. And they're arguing that because they did a small check of compliance to the W3C standards. And they say, oh, the standards say I'm accessible, I'm doing anything anymore. So, as a consequence of these answers, after the public prosecutor's office started to think what we can do to address this problem. So he reached to two conclusions. First, there's a lack of interest of the private entities in adjusting their accessibility of their websites. There's a lack of interest, that's for sure. And the other point was the omission of the federal government to exercise its duty to regulate and supervise compliance with the law. That means both the companies and the government has a role to play in this accessibility, digital accessibility field. And that led to the filing of a new public civil claim, number 65. So one thing that's interesting, that's the public prosecutor office didn't bring any charges against the media companies, any charges, any fines. And we say that the public prosecutor's office only addressed the government side of the problem. And this public civil claim that was filed on the federal court in São Paulo asked mainly for four points. The first one, the public prosecutor office wanted that the Brazil adopt the standards of the W3C. So they asked for the judge to make that the W3C standards be a Brazilian standard enforceable by law. The second request that the public prosecutor's office made by the judge was that the government only make advertisement contracts with companies that have accessible websites. At least in Brazil, I don't know here in Australia, it's very common that the government pays money to news companies to advertise programs and services. So what the PPO wants to do here is to use this purchase power that the government has to pressure to companies to become accessible through this lack of resources or withdrawal of resources. That the third point is to establish an accessibility implementation schedule. As I told before, regarding the accessibility features on broadcast companies, we had a schedule. I don't remember exactly, I don't know if 10 years, all the programs have to have some audio description or subtitles. So the PPO wants that the judge rules on this, wants to make a new schedule to implement accessibility in all the news media companies. And the last point that I think that's the most important, the PPO wants that the judge oblige the state to regulate. He wants to force the state to regulate on media and accessibility, creating a clear rule, a more robust rule. So here I brought some points to discuss that I think that are important. First one is, what does the change in the company's answers mean? For me, Matheus Ferreira, means that a specific legislation can make a difference, because we can see a difference of posture. The first one was, no, I don't have any obligation. The second posture was, yeah, I have some obligations, but I don't know how to do it. The second discussion point is, there was a long time to fix all the problems. As I told you in my timeline, all the civil inquiry started in 2014. And until now, in 2020, we don't have any ruling on this matter. It is still being decided by the judge. And one thing that's terrible, it's because the judge invited the government and the public prosecutor office to make a conciliatory meeting, but the government didn't go. So it's just the PPO without anything. And another point that I think that's important, it's Brazilian law, we don't have any mechanisms to enforce the law. So we have a law that says that's mandatory to have accessibility, but you don't have anything to enforce that. Maybe the PPO has a small role in enforcing accessibility, but the PPO has a broad role. It's not specific to deal with accessibility issues. And in the end, for me, if you rely on only the company's internal practices to address accessibility, to regulate accessibility, maybe be a mistake, because the companies are very comfortable with their standards, at least in Brazil, very comfortable with a low bar of what accessibility means. They're comfortable on doing the basic, are comfortable because no one will get there and enforce some legislation on fines on them. So that's it.
Obrigado, Matheus.
Thank you.
Here we go. Now, don't disappear just yet, because I'm sure there might be a couple of burning questions. That's a long struggle, 2014 to now still. Wow. Are there any questions from within the audience? Bree.
This sounds very much like our national transition strategy. Did you, in your research, did you see that there were similarities that happened in other countries as well? Because we've been through this with Australia, and that's while we had a national transition strategy?
So my focus here is just comparing Brazil and Australia. So I don't have any knowledge about other countries, but I can see some similarities between Brazil and Australia. This part of the lack of enforcement, how to enforce the legislation is different. And the other thing that's different between Brazil and Australia, it's because we have like this right written in the law. You have to provide accessibility, or even the government have to eliminate barriers and to information and communication. In Australia, law is different. It's like in discrimination. If you do this, you are discriminated. So in Brazil, it's different. It's like a more positive right, as Matt told yesterday.
Thank you, Matheus. Very entertaining. Question: has arranging finances for advertising had any effect?
So, because in some companies, this is just a small part of the budget. For instance, to Globo, that's the biggest communication group in Brazil, it only represents 5% of the all revenue. So I don't know if it's that big stick, you know, it's a 5% stick. So I don't know if it can change anything.
Excellent. Is it quick, Alfred?
Yeah.
Go for it.
Matheus, I know you talked about news websites. Any comment on online shopping or e-commerce or government websites? Are they more accessible in Brazil?
Well, first point, government websites. In Brazil, we have a legislation this legislation that I told about, the 10098, but was regulated in 2014, that mandates that all websites of the government have to follow, I have here the name. It's a model of accessibility that was inspired by the W3C standards and the section 508 of the US. So their own government has their own standards to their websites. And all websites had to be accessible on 2014, but the enforcement is still not that good. But now there's a difference that all branches of the government have to report their accessibility to a specific part of the government. But I don't know what they do with these reports, you know, if they just put on the, you know.
All right.
What was the online shopping? I don't know exactly the legislation on this. There's in Brazil we have the National Plan of the Consumers, and now in 2017, a new law was approved that there is accessibility in the law, saying that every company has to provide accessible products and services. But there's a movement in Brazil, the Movimento Webs para Todos, like Web for All, and they surveyed the accessibility of these retail websites and was very low, very, very low.
If you could all join me in thanking Matheus. Thank you.